Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Joseph David. He's going to be telling us about bone health and osteoporosis. Dr. David grew up in Sparta, New Jersey, and he obtained his medical degree from Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson School of Medicine. He moved to Pennsylvania and to complete his family medicine training. This summer is going to be very exciting from him. He graduates from his residency program and welcomes his first child.
Yes. Thank you.
Dr. Joe.
All right. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Let's just get back here. And yeah, I've got a lot of exciting life milestones coming up here shortly. So definitely excited, a little bit nervous, but mostly excited for all those things. So yeah, thank you for having me. This is great to be back at Cathedral Village. Spent some time here with Dr. Bryce and Dr. Sim and Dr. Skiblo. So this is great to be back. And I think we all enjoy as residents getting the opportunity to come in and do these community talks. So today we thought that just talking about general bone health and going a little bit into osteoporosis and what osteoporosis means would be a good topic. Without further ado, I can kind of get into this. And yeah, I thought this was just kind of a fun little thumbs up picture there. So all right. So just to kind of start things off, just to go through an outline of what I'll be talking about today. I figured I'd give a little bit of background information about just bone health in general, kind of what that means throughout the lifespan of a human being. And then spend some time just defining osteoporosis and a few other important terms that often get thrown around. And then talk a little bit about different risk factors and characteristics and habits that sometimes can put patients at a little bit higher risk for developing osteoporosis, and then spend some time talking about how we screen for bone health and the types of testing and diagnostic tests that we would run if someone is diagnosed with osteoporosis, and kind of what that follow-up looks like. And obviously just talking a little bit about the management of both osteoporosis, but just, strategies to reduce your risk of developing osteoporosis down the road, and just kind of maintaining healthy, strong bones. And then a little bit of a deep dive into, or not really a deep dive, but kind of just a little bit of an overview of the indications for different medications that can be used to help treat osteoporosis. So just to kind of give you a little snapshot of kind of where we're headed. So just to kind of start off, just to give a little bit of background about bone health in general and what that means just in terms of the life cycle of human bones and your skeletal structure. And just to walk through this with you, when we're in childhood, a lot of what defines our bone health and kind of sets us up for lifelong bone health, it's sort of a multifactorial picture where a huge part of this is focusing on healthy diet, healthy balanced diet that includes obviously things like food sources that are rich in calcium and vitamin D. So dairy products like milk, cheeses, yogurts. But it's also equally important to, make sure that at a young age, we're being introduced to just a totally well-balanced diet. Things like healthy proteins, fruits and vegetables that have, extremely important nutrients and vitamins that also are equally important for like laying down sort of our foundation, setting us up for lifelong bone health. And the other really critically important aspect of this, particularly in childhood, is just making sure that we're active, we're getting plenty of physical activity, specifically, things that are weight-bearing activities, because as we work our work our muscles and build muscle mass, we're also simultaneously working our bones and working our skeletal structure and kind of challenging our bones and our muscles that way, help them grow stronger. And there's really a critically important period of time, you know, from the time we're born until about the age of 18 to 20, where, you know, approximately 90% of your bone mass is laid down in kind of that first 18, 20 years of life. You know, all of those lifestyle, you know, choices that I talked about obviously are in our control and are important foundational aspects of bone health. But then there's elements of this that, you know, we don't have control over, such as genetics. So some of us are just predisposed genetically to being at a little bit higher risk of developing osteoporosis later in life. So, you know, even if you do everything right, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you wouldn't be at risk for developing osteoporosis later on. And, you know, like I mentioned, you know, the vast majority of your bone mass and bone density is laid down in those first 18 to 20 years of life. And then really we see kind of a plateau where your body kind of stops necessarily building up or adding to the foundation of your skeletal structure, and you more or less kind of just see it level off for really a number of years. You know, once we start kind of entering into our fourth or fifth, sixth decade of life, that's where we start to see a little bit of a decline in bone density and bone strength. You know, part of this is also specifically for female patients. You know, a critically important junction here is going through menopause. Estrogen, one of the hormones that, you know, for most of your adult life that your body naturally produces, that the drop off in estrogen levels once you go through menopause as a female patient, that no longer provides a protective factor that is something that we don't often think about, you know, with you know, those hormones and estrogen, that's critically important for helping to kind of protect your bone mass and bone strength. So that's often a contributory factor that we see for patients around this age, where we start seeing a little bit of a more rapid decline in bone density. And once again, similar to, you know, earlier stages of life, those same elements of eating a healthy diet, making sure that we're getting plenty of weight-bearing physical activity, those are the same things that not only, you know, they helped us build a strong, healthy foundation, but they also help us sort of slow down that rate of decline in our bone mass. So you can kind of see, you know, there's a little bit of a slower rate of decline if we're really able to incorporate healthy, well-balanced diet and weight-bearing exercise into our daily routine. And we'll get into a little bit more about, you know, what osteoporosis is and what that means. So that's kind of a 10,000-foot view of the life cycle of bone health. And, you know, both early on and just throughout our lives, it's obviously it goes back to the basics of healthy diet and exercise. But I know we stress that a lot in the world of primary care for a number of reasons. And you could tack on one more reason to focus on those things is to help protect your bones. So just to talk a little bit more and a few other points just related to what we were just discussing. There is a little bit of a difference between patients in terms of sex. So like we were talking about, female patients typically have a little bit higher risk of developing decreased bone density and developing osteoporosis. And a large part of that is postmenopausal patients lose that protective factor of estrogen. And so you can see that once, you know, around the fifth decade of life, the majority of patients go through menopause, you can see a little bit more of a precipitous decline in skeletal bone mass. And specifically, you know, this is something they've done a lot of research on, and even just measuring the amount of calcium in your skeletal structure in grams, they've been able to show that you know, we have a little bit of a less dense skeletal structure once we are entering into that fifth, sixth decade of life and beyond. So what we see though is that after that period of time, the decline in bone strength or bone density kind of equates to that of male patients. So after that sort of transitional period, the rate of decline is pretty equivalent both in men and women. So again, it's just something to be cognizant of. That a lot of this is predetermined in our earlier stages of life, where the quote of the hay's already in the barn kind of a thing. If you put in the work of trying to lead a healthy lifestyle for most of your adult life, it sets you up for success, even when you hit some of these transitional periods, where no matter how much weight-bearing exercise or how healthy of a diet that you subscribe to, a lot of this is, like I said, kind of it's unavoidable, just in the sense that a lot of this is just genetically predetermined. So just things that I think are important to be aware of. So just to kind of transition over to defining what some of these things mean. The actual definition of osteoporosis is it's a skeletal disorder that's characterized by compromised bone strength, so specifically bone density. So kind of like we were talking about how much calcium deposited and calcium in grams that they can measure in your bones, and the bone quality. So that meaning just kind of how porous are your bones, how solid is the structure of each of your skeletal structures, and again, just being predisposed to increased risk of fractures and breaking your bones later in life. And there's a couple of different sort of subtypes of osteoporosis. So, I think the clinical osteoporosis is perhaps what we're more familiar with, where we use bone density scans to help measure and compare your bone density to those of younger patients, younger individuals with quote unquote, normal bone density. And clinical osteoporosis is diagnosed when someone has a bone density that's measured as 2.5 standard deviations below that of a younger individual. And that person who has a bone mineral density of 2.5 standard deviations below that normal reference range, that person might be completely asymptomatic. They might not have ever had any broken bones up to that point, or really any issues, but just being able to see that value, that's enough for us to make the clinical diagnosis of osteoporosis. And I think just that's important to kind of compare to and understand the difference between that and what we would consider established osteoporosis. So this is a diagnosis that can be made without a bone density scan. And this is where patients who have suffered from what we would consider a fragility fracture, such as falling from standing height or less, or very minor trauma that's leading to a broken bone. So not things like car accidents or some kind of really traumatic sports accident. This would be something like standing in the shower, falling down, and you maybe have a broken bone in your spine or your hip just from falling from standing height. These fragility fractures, again, most commonly occurring in the spine, the hip, at the wrist, humerus, ribs, or pelvis. That alone allows a healthcare provider to make the diagnosis of osteoporosis without even having to get the DEXA scan. I think typically in cases like that, you would still follow up and measure the bone density, but you wouldn't even need to in that sense to make the diagnosis of what we would call established osteoporosis. And then I think I have a picture on the next slide that kind of gives you a little bit of a better visual of this, but there's sort of an intermediate stage here where there's sort of what's considered healthy bone on one end of the spectrum, and then, porous or fragile bones that are kind of, that meet the criteria for the diagnosis of osteoporosis. But in between, there's sort of this intermediate stage. We talked about on a bone density scan that to be considered for osteoporosis, the density has to be 2.5 standard deviations below that of a younger, younger individual with normal bone density. But if you fall in between 1 to 2.5 standard deviations, so you're not quite at the 2.5 standard deviation mark or lower, but there is some change relative to that of the reference range. That's sort of this intermediate stage of bone health or bone density that we refer to as osteopenia. That I would say is, if you're familiar, osteopenia, you can almost think of it, I think it's somewhat analogous to like pre-diabetes, if you've ever heard that term, where your bones are not in that 2.5 standard deviation range, similar to if you have blood sugar that's not at the cutoff for diabetes, which is the hemoglobin A1C number that's 6.5 or higher. It's not like you have osteoporosis, but having osteopenia, much like having prediabetes, it's just sort of a signal to your healthcare providers that you are at higher risk for going on to develop osteoporosis. So again, there's definitely value in getting a scheduled bone density scan when it's indicated, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, just to be able to distinguish between these things and know if you fall into one of these categories, and particularly if you have osteopenia, to really kind of ramp up your efforts of getting back on track with healthy diet, weight-bearing exercise to help stave off, developing osteoporosis down the road. So that's kind of just an overview of some of the common terminology that you might be familiar with or you've heard, and just to kind of parse that out a little bit more. So let me just kind of move along here, and like I was talking about, I have a little bit of a helpful visual here just to kind of put into perspective kind of what we were talking about, where understanding that healthy bone is it's the elements of a healthy bone structure. Things that we think about are there's sort of an outer cortex of your bone that's really strong and calcified, but the inner portion of your bone is actually, if you zoom in on it, it's actually kind of porous in structure. So there's almost these tiny microscopic little holes. And in healthy bone, that porous structure, it's really very, very small spaces in between kind of the material that makes up your bones. But as your bone density decreases over time, those kind of little openings or pores in between the bone structure, they can start to enlarge. And so, as you can maybe even visualize just looking at this schema, the enlarging pores in the inner structure of your bone, you could almost imagine that the inside of this bone is going to be much lighter, much less dense relative to, again, kind of the reference range or an individual with healthy bone structure. And that's literally what we're talking about when we're talking about bone density and defining these terms of osteopenia versus osteoporosis, where literally as over time, as that bone density decreases and the porous structure inside the bones kind of opens up, that you can appreciate that here, looking at someone with osteopenia versus someone with severe advanced osteoporosis. And so I think that's just kind of a helpful way to think about this, is literally the pores in between your bones. It's kind of opening up, and the bones themselves just becoming less dense over time. So just to kind of transition over to understanding elements that put us at risk for developing low bone density, things like osteopenia, osteoporosis. I think it's important to understand, and we kind of referenced this earlier, but there are elements that are in our control and elements that are not in our control. So we kind of call those modifiable versus non-modifiable risk factors. Things that are non-modifiable that we have no control over really, are things like your genetics, things like your gender, your race, different genders, races, and genetic makeups can put individuals at varying degrees of risk. And obviously we have no control over those things. That's just kind of be a kind of built-in level of risk that an individual might have. But then there are quite a few of modifiable risk factors. So elements that are in our control that can help us kind of reduce our risk of developing decreased bone fragility. And like we were talking about, some of these things are pretty intuitive, but eating a healthy diet, again, like we were talking about, with plenty of calcium, vitamin D, which you often will get from things like dairy products, healthy fruits and vegetables, healthy sources of protein. So really focusing on healthy, balanced diet, specifically getting regular exercise. And not all forms of exercise are created equal. So when we talk about exercise relative to talking about bone health, we really want to make sure we're incorporating weight-bearing exercise. And I know I've used that term several times already, but things where your full body weight is being used and sort of your skeletal structure is being asked to support your full body weight, those are the types of activities that are going to give you the best sort of protective effect. So things as simple as walking, or even doing resistance training with weights can be excellent forms of weight-bearing exercise. Unfortunately, we really encourage patients to any form of exercise is great, but if we're concerned about bone health, we actually ask, if possible, again, this isn't possible for everyone, but if possible, to try to limit the amount of non-weight bearing exercise. So things like riding a bike or swimming, where your weight is being somewhat supported and offloaded. We ask some of these patients to actually stray away from getting in a routine with those types of exercises and really focus on weight-bearing activities. So I think that's a really important point here, is that all exercise is good, but when it comes to bone health, we really want to focus in on weight-bearing exercise. Other elements here that I think are obviously important, alcohol consumption and smoking. Obviously, those increase your risk of a lot of concerning things, and bone fragility is one of them. So patients who have been heavy smokers at some time in their life or are currently smoking, we often try to focus on tobacco cessation efforts to, again, mitigate the risk of developing bone fragility or osteopenia or osteoporosis. And similarly, excessive alcohol consumption, again, that can obviously negatively affect your health in a number of ways. And again, bone health is one of them. So again, limiting excessive alcohol consumption, and again, just kind of based on general recommendations, it's recommended that female patients have, trying to limit themselves to less than 1 drink per day, and for men, it's less than 2 alcoholic beverages per day. Anything above those thresholds is considered, a little bit of excessive alcohol consumption, and those can increase your risk of developing diminished bone density. And then I think, again, kind of similar concept to the weight-bearing exercise notion, but just to talk a little bit about your general body weight. Again, this is a little bit counterintuitive, but we often focus and counsel patients on trying to maintain a healthy weight, healthy BMI or body mass index, so your weight relative to your height. Because obviously being overweight can put you at risk for concerning things like high blood pressure or diabetes or high cholesterol. But there is a lot of data out there that shows that individuals who do have a little bit of an excess body weight or higher weight, they actually have lower risk of developing osteopenia or osteoporosis, because they, in a sense, almost have a little bit more of a built-in weight-bearing experience, just going about their daily activities, whether they're exercising or not, just kind of existing day to day, their skeletal structure is going to be put under a little bit more stress than someone who is very light or very thin. Those individuals who maybe have a lighter BMI or lighter weight, those are the individuals who are a little bit higher risk for developing, osteopenia or osteoporosis. So it's one of the few instances where being overweight is really not, it's not a bad thing when it comes to your bone health. So just an interesting idea to be familiar with. So. And I apologize if a few of these slides are a little bit wordy. This is one of them, but I'll kind of walk you through the highlights here. I wanted to take some time to talk more specifically about how we screen individuals for osteoporosis. And generally, again, there's a little bit of a difference because of some of those graphics I was showing you earlier. Because of increased risk in female patients, the guidelines are a little bit different for men relative to women. So for women, we typically recommend that all women get screened for osteoporosis once they hit the age of 65 or older, even if they don't really have any obvious risk factors, even if they have never had a broken bone before. We just recommend all patients get screened at least once starting at age 65, just to kind of make sure that we're not missing anything. Like I said, you can either have established osteoporosis or clinical osteoporosis, and screening someone with a DEXA scan or a bone density scan. And if they meet that criteria, that would be kind of considered, I guess, clinical osteoporosis, even if they didn't have obvious risk factors or known fractures. So, and then, the equation changes a little bit. If someone has, additional risk factors that would kind of clue you into them being at higher risk for developing osteopenia or osteoporosis. Again, those are kind of related to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Someone is, extremely low weight or has a known family history of bone fragility, or is a lifelong smoker or has struggled with alcohol use in the past, or if they're on for other medical reasons, if they're on certain medications that would increase their risk of bone fragility. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but things off the top of my head, the big ones that we often think about are patients who have been on steroid medications for a number of years. That can affect your bone health, and patients who have been on anti-inflammatory medicines to treat conditions like rheumatoid arthritis. Those types of medicines can increase your risk. So there's a tool that we can use as clinicians to help us decide if someone meets the criteria to get checked for osteoporosis earlier than the age of 65. And there's actually a basically risk calculator that we use. It's called the FRAX score. And based on a patient's age, their weight, their risk factors, if they meet a certain threshold or have a high enough risk, we can justify basically screening them earlier before the age of 65. And so that's like a risk calculator that we are able to use, that's based on, again, years of research and data that they've pooled, and it's a really helpful tool in that way. So again, some patients will be screened earlier than the age of 65, specifically for female patients. And then the equation changes a little bit when we're talking about male patients. There's not really like consensus on necessarily screening all male patients for bone density. There's ongoing studies and to look at this and assess if maybe at some point down the road they will come out with some kind of general recommendation to screen all male patients at a certain age. But as of right now, if someone doesn't really have any obvious risk factors, you don't necessarily have to screen a male patient who is low, you would consider low risk. Again, though, if someone is, has an elevated FRAX score because they have a number of these risk factors that we were talking about earlier, again, you can make the same justification to then at that point screen an individual just to kind of get a gauge on what their bone density looks like. So, and just to kind of briefly touch on, we use the bone mineral density measurement using like a DEXA scan, which basically it's almost like a specialized X-ray that gives us pictures of some of the major bones in your body, like your femur, your lower spine, and based on the density of those bones, we can kind of extrapolate based on those numbers, and kind of come to a number that they're able to calculate. Again, it's that 2.5 standard deviation or below that we're looking for to make the clinical diagnosis of osteoporosis. So, and again, this clinical calculator that I was referencing, the FRAX tool, it's just a free online resource that is just made available to all healthcare providers to be able to kind of help guide us of who to screen and when. So just to kind of touch on that a little bit. And so just to kind of pivot and talk about if you were to be diagnosed with osteoporosis, whether that be clinical or having established osteoporosis and having one of these fragility fractures that we talked about earlier. There's a couple of different pieces of blood work that are recommended to obtain, right, kind of at the onset of diagnosis. Some of these things, like a comprehensive metabolic panel, is useful just to be able to assess what your blood calcium levels are, your renal function. Your kidneys play a very large role in, calcium and vitamin D metabolism. So just being able to assess your renal health is important in the context of bone health. Similarly, your phosphorus levels, that's another important element there of understanding what your phosphorus levels are. That plays into your bone health. And obviously, like we were talking about, vitamin D levels, that's where this can come into play. Some patients also have history of thyroid disease, and your thyroid hormone plays a very important role in general metabolism, but also in bone remodeling. And so patients who maybe have their thyroid that's a little out of whack, checking a TSH at this point is a good idea, just to kind of make sure we're not missing a secondary cause of decreased bone density. There's a couple other pieces of blood work that they sometimes consider getting. A parathyroid hormone is another one where, again, similar to the thyroid hormone, it plays an important role in sort of determining the rate of bone metabolism. And similarly, just to kind of better assess renal health, we sometimes consider getting what's called a 24-hour urine collection. Again, to kind of better understand how your body is metabolizing and excreting calcium, and also gauge your renal function. And sometimes for certain patients, we might check your blood counts as well, just to kind of make sure that we're not missing other elements that could be contributing to decreased bone density. So kind of cast a wide net when we make the initial diagnosis, just to kind of make sure that we're getting a full clinical picture of what's going on and that we're not missing anything important. Because obviously, if we were to discover your thyroid hormone being out of whack or low levels of vitamin D or phosphorus, there's obviously ways that we can treat those conditions, which ultimately would be really important for helping to preserve bone density. So, and now we talked about some of these things already, but just to kind of spend a little bit of time focusing in on how we manage osteoporosis and osteopenia, and ways in which that we can reduce our risk of developing those conditions. And I won't belabor the point, but just to kind of reiterate, weight-bearing exercise is so important. The general recommendation is trying to get at least 30 minutes of weight-bearing exercise in, at least 5 times a week. I mean, even daily, ideally, if that's possible, just to kind of, again, kind of just for general maintenance of your bones and your skeletal structure. Mitigating fall risk, obviously, certain patients have a number of risk factors that increase our risk for falling. And if you have decreased bone density, that's a bad combination if you're also someone that has increased fall risk. So trying to be cognizant of various ways that we can mitigate fall risk, like making sure there's proper lighting and footing in someone's living space, making sure they have proper footwear. Basic elements like that can go a long way in preventing potentially a fragility fracture. Like we talked about already, really limiting tobacco use or smoking and avoiding excessive alcohol intake. Like I mentioned before, that's what that comes out to, is trying to have less than 1 drink a day as a female patient and less than 2 drinks a day as a male patient. And then there are kind of general goals of calcium and vitamin D intake based on your age. So with regards to vitamin D, for patients who are between the age of 50 and 70 years old, we try to shoot for 600 units of vitamin D a day. And for those age 70 or older, that number goes up a little bit to 800 units. Again, just kind of as we were looking at before with some of the graphics, older we get, the lower our bone density gets. So to kind of compensate for that known decrease, we can kind of, just try to increase the amount of vitamin D that we're consuming daily. The other big important element related to vitamin D, and I have it bulleted here, is just making sure that we're getting outside and or at the very least getting close to a window and getting some natural sunlight. The best way to kind of get natural vitamin D production in your body is sun exposure. So that's another important element that shouldn't be overlooked. Obviously for some patients, depending on your vitamin D levels or your renal function, we sometimes need to check other elements that could be related to your vitamin D, and even recommend higher doses of vitamin D supplementation, either indefinitely or for brief periods of time to kind of get you back up to the normal range. And then, similar concept here, but I believe this graphic came from the Institute for the Foundation of Osteoporosis, of Bone Health and Osteoporosis, and they have kind of age calcium goals. So younger individuals, again, as like we were talking about earlier, adolescents between the age of 13 to 18, that's when, again, 90% of your bone density is being laid down, really trying to make sure that you're getting plenty of calcium within that critical age range. And then, for individuals who are 50 years old or younger, that number goes down a little bit to 1,000. Again, that window of bone density increases is kind of closed, but we can, just for maintenance, make sure that we're getting at least 1,000 milligrams. And then there's a little bit of a divergence depending on if you're male or female, but for women over the age of 50, we try to then increase that calcium intake to 1,200 milligrams. And then for men, the critical age cutoff is 70. So if you're under 70, it's similar to women age 50 or younger, it's 1,000 milligrams. If you're over 70, that number goes up just a little bit to 1,200. So again, just really making sure that we're getting plenty of vitamin D and calcium, and alongside weight-bearing exercise is really the best way to mitigate our risk. And then just to kind of touch briefly on, indications for medications that we sometimes use to treat osteoporosis. Individuals who are formally diagnosed with established osteoporosis, again, that being maybe an individual who had a fragility fracture, or individuals who are clinically diagnosed with osteoporosis based on a DEXA scan, with that bone mineral density score being less than 2.5. Those are indications to be considered for treatment with the most common form of medication that we often use is a class of medicines called bisphosphonates. So things like Fosamax, where the recommendation generally is for individuals who, are able to tolerate these medicines. The current recommendation is to be treated with these bisphosphonates for 5 years. The data that we have right now shows that being treated with one of these types of medicines can kind of significantly slow down the rate of bone density decline. Now, there's not, again, these are things that they're studying currently, and these guidelines probably will change it over time, but as of right now, there's not any clear guideline or recommendation to treat beyond 5 years. It's kind of a case-by-case situation. So generally right now with these osteoporosis-specific medicines, specifically like bisphosphonates, like Fosamax, it's really just a 5-year window that you would be considered to be treated for. Again, with the hope of just significantly slowing down the rate of your decline in bone density to mitigate the risk of fractures. So, and then I think just to make the point that there's not any clear guidelines on treating individuals who just have osteopenia with these types of medicines. So if you get a bone density score and it, like we were talking about earlier, falls within this range of 1 to 2.5 standard deviations below the normal, there's not really data that says that you would be a candidate for these types of medicines. So again, these are fluid recommendations. I'm sure over time, as they continue to do more research, like maybe those recommendations will change. But as of right now, there's not concrete guidelines that say that individuals with osteopenia would be candidates to be treated with osteoporosis medicines. And then I think the other really important aspect when we're talking about medications in the context of osteoporosis is just following up with your healthcare provider to really make sure that you're staying on top of what medications you really should be on and which ones you shouldn't be anymore. So there's some, like we were talking about earlier, there are certain medications that can increase your risk of developing osteoporosis. Things like chronic steroid medications, things, believe it or not, even like proton pump inhibitors that, things like Prilosec or omeprazole that patients often are started on because they have reflux. Those medicines can actually inhibit and affect your ability to naturally absorb and digest calcium and vitamin D from your diet. And so over time, that can increase your risk of diminished bone density. So just talking to your healthcare provider, PCP, about really being vigilant about making sure that you're not taking any unnecessary medications, or that some medications that you used to be on, just kind of really being critical about which ones you really should keep taking and which ones are no longer necessary, because a lot of these medicines can increase risk of decreased bone density. So and just kind of in summary here, just to recap, just really, I think when we're talking about bone health, just getting back to the basics, like we started off talking about, things like diet and exercise are so important in so many different avenues of our health, and protecting your bones is no different. Things like weight-bearing exercise, or things as simple as walking can go a long way in helping to preserve your bone strength. Things like making sure you're eating a healthy, balanced diet with plenty of calcium and vitamin D, and obviously equally goes a long way in helping to protect your bones. And following up with your healthcare provider, just again, being vigilant and paying attention to your medication list, and making sure that any non-essential medicines, particularly those that might increase your risk of decreased bone health, are getting taken off your list. And just making sure that you're up to date with all of your recommended screenings. So that's all I've got for you guys today, but happy to field any questions that you might have.
What was the address again for you had an email, not an email, a website? Hi. Yes, so my question is, you had on one of the slides, a
Yes.
www.SHE, a website that I wanted to explore.
Yes, let me see if I can find that.
I think it was.
It was beyond,
All the text. Right in there somewhere.
maybe this one.
It's the crack score. Yeah, the crack score.
Crack score, okay.
Yes.
This
There.
one. Yeah, so, these guidelines come from the US Preventative Service Task Force. So, they have their own website, the USPSTF website. And then there's also the WHO, the World Health Organization. That would be another really great resource that would provide you with up-to-date screening guidelines. Yeah, there's quite a few online resources that, this was just kind of, my talk today was just sort of the tip of the iceberg, but there's absolutely, there's a lot more information out there that goes into much more detail than what I did today. So absolutely, if you want to do your own research and look into some of these things, all of these websites that I tried to pull from are really valuable resources. So, yeah, absolutely.
Is there a big connection between arthritis and osteoporosis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's different kinds of arthritis. That's a very good question. There's osteoarthritis, which is sort of the degradation of the cartilage or the cushioning in between your joints. And over time, I do think that if you have very advanced osteoarthritis, so diminished amounts of cartilage in certain joints, that the friction from your bone kind of rubbing up against another bone, I think that can lead to an accelerated picture for a certain individual potentially developing osteoporosis. But then it's important also to distinguish that from, there's another form of common arthritis called rheumatoid arthritis. And that's more of an inflammatory condition. That in and of itself, I believe, yes, can increase risk of diminished bone density. And then that's extra concerning just in the sense that a lot of patients who have rheumatoid arthritis are treated with steroid medications. And so there's almost kind of a multifactorial picture there where the condition itself and the medicines that are used to treat it can kind of both work together and increase your risk of osteoporosis. So yeah, I do believe that, both of those forms of arthritis can increase your risk. It's a really good question. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's not a lot of study about using these medicines beyond 5 years. I mean, I've been through all of them, including Forteo, and so
Yeah.
it's been well over 5 years, probably 20. So the studies aren't, and now I'm polio, the studies aren't there beyond 5 years.
I think it just in general, the recommendation is still, they say 5 years is sort of the extent that they have concrete data that shows that there's like absolutely a benefit. That's not to say that you wouldn't get benefit from taking it longer than that. If you've had success with taking it for upwards of some of these various medications for 20 years, I think like I was talking about, it is kind of patient to patient, case by case dependent. And so I think they are, again, they're kind of doing a lot of studies right now to look at, patients kind of more similar to your case who have been on these medicines for beyond 5 years. And I think it's more just a matter of they just haven't accumulated enough data to come out and say, yes, it's safe to kind of keep taking these beyond 5 years. But there are plenty of people out there who've been taking them for a long time and are having a lot of success with it. So I think it's more of just sort of like a technicality. They just haven't, I don't think, done quite enough research to come out and make like a fully fledged recommendation. But I would not be shocked if in the near future that changes. But yeah, that's a really good point. There's plenty of people out there who've been taking these types of medicines for beyond 5 years, for sure. Yeah.
I get a lot of ads for a product called strontium.
I will be totally honest with you, I'm not familiar with that medicine. I would have to look that up. Is it like, I guess an osteoporosis medicine or?
It's for the bones.
Okay,
Not
yeah.
strontium 90, just strontium.
okay. I'll be honest with you, I would have to look that one up. That's new to me. I'm not sure. Can't really comment on that one, but yeah, I'd have to kind of look into that and, kind of find out for myself.
Want to ask the Zoom audience if they.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody watching from home with any questions?
Actually, Diane's not there. No.
Somebody's.
I think that's not her. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I think, oh, really? Okay. Okay.
And they're all muted, so. But yes, if they unmute yourself if you have a question.
Yeah. Yeah. Anybody who's still watching at home, if you want to hit the unmute button, if you do have a question, and, happy to answer any questions you might have.
No more questions?
Okay.
Thank you
Oh,
so much.
yes. Oh, yes. Sorry.
About taking omeprazole,
Mm-hmm.
You could break every bone in my body and I wouldn't give up my omeprazole.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things. I think a lot of it's kind of, medicine is both a science and an art. And I think it's weighing the risks and benefits of all the different medicines we take. And I think, depending on what you're taking your omeprazole for, I agree. I mean, I think for some patients, it doesn't necessarily always make sense to discontinue a medicine for one reason, if the reason you're taking it is obviously affecting your health. Yeah. So again, I would, something maybe to ask your primary care physician or provider prescribe that for you, kind of their thoughts on that. But I agree. I think it is case by case, and then, we're always having to kind of weigh the risks and benefits of, taking a certain medication. And, pretty much all medications are not totally benign. They all come with their side effects and their risks. So, I think that's something that I would say is sort of like case by case. But that's just sort of a general recommendation. Is some patients who have more mild reflux can get away with stopping their omeprazole and don't necessarily need to be on it for an extended period of time. But that's absolutely not true for all patients. So yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I have a daughter-in-law who's
a leukemia survivor, and she has been getting Prolia injections for about 30 years. And her bone density has improved to osteopenia, and she's very active. So this is one case where prolonged use doesn't seem to do any harm.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great point. I'm so glad to hear, first of all, that she's doing so well. And yeah, like I said, I think some of these recommendations are generalized for someone who has had like a leukemia diagnosis. I think that can change the equation, particularly if, like we were talking about earlier, you have risk factors that would, kind of affect your bone density at a younger age. I think that does kind of change the equation in terms of which medications that you would be a candidate for and the kind of the extent that you would be treated with them. So yeah, I think that's a really important point that, again, kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier. It's case by case. And I think I would not be surprised if down the road, some of these recommendations change, just because there are plenty of people out there who've been on a lot of these osteoporosis related medicines for a number of years and have really great results. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah.
I have another question.
This has to do with children who don't have the kind of diet that they need to have. I'm thinking about all those children over in Gaza who are, lucky to get clean water, but they aren't getting milk and cheese and all of those kinds of things. What kind of prognosis is there for them to be able to catch up at all if they were able to get on a regular diet, say by the age, say after 4 years of being insufficiently calcium deprived?
Yeah, it is, it's really unfortunate that, you know, we don't all have the privilege or the luxury to have access to great healthcare or to, you know, be able to have access to, you know, the ingredients to have a healthy, balanced diet. I do think, unfortunately, you know, like we were talking about in that early window, that period of time in sort of the first 18 to 20 years of life, that's where the vast majority of your bone density gets laid down. I do think that you know, you're talking about kind of thinking about the age of around age 4. I do think that there, to some extent, there is, you know, the possibility that if they were able to kind of incorporate, you know, vitamin D and calcium back into their diet around that time, that they could theoretically catch up. But I do think that there is a, you know, there's a certain amount of opportunity to lay down bone density that they're unfortunately, you know, kind of missing and being deprived of, that I think at some level they would never fully catch back up. So it's hard to say exact prognosis, but I do think that individuals in that situation would obviously be at higher risk later in life to have potentially bone density issues.
Well, these same children, for example, thinking about the migrant children, they are walking a lot every day to get, you know, from where is in Guatemala up to the border. So how much does that help them with the fact that they may not be getting enough calcium in their diet?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's an interesting question. Hard to say, like, if, you know, doing more weight-bearing exercise can counteract the, you know, decreased amount of dietary needs that they have. I'm not sure if, you know, research like that has been done, and maybe it has, and I'm just not aware, but I do unfortunately think that you kind of need all the elements working together to get proper bone structure and lay that foundation. So I think it's, yeah, in some sense it's you know, protective that they're able to maybe get more weight bearing exercise in with things like walking, but I think without the nutritional component, I would probably venture to say that probably wouldn't kind of overcompensate or allow them to kind of have normal bone health development at that stage. So yeah, it's an interesting point though that you bring up for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, what would you recommend for an 80-year-old to maintain their bone density?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think like we were talking about, you know, I think a lot of this goes back to thinking about the modifiable risk factors that we have total control over. So things like making sure that you're getting plenty of weight-bearing exercise if possible. So things as simple as walking every day can go a long way in preserving bone health. And also just the dietary nutritional component is important too. So like we were talking about, making sure that if you're 80 and up over the 70 age range, making sure you're getting at least 800 units of vitamin D and at least 1,200 milligrams of calcium. So I think just kind of going back to what we were talking about, just really making sure it's more of a holistic, well-rounded approach of diet and weight-bearing exercise. But that's, yeah, it's a good point.
So if you're not allowed to have calcium, what can you do?
That's a good question. That I'm not 100% sure how to get around that one. If you had some kind of dietary restriction with calcium, I'll be honest, I'm not sure exactly how to approach that one. That's a very good question though.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very welcome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, you're welcome. Let's see. And do I just kind of X out of here or what? Do I just sort of X out of the PowerPoint?
You want to get outside. Okay, can't we just shut it down?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what
just shut it
I'll
down.
just, kind of show.
Yeah.
Burnt down.
That'd be fun.